The nanny was an angel to the millionaire father, but to the new cleaning lady, she was a monster. While the boss saw only smiles, the cleaning lady saw panic in the boy's eyes whenever the nanny approached. Nobody believed her suspicions until one day she heard a terrified scream coming from the child's room. She broke down the door, and the scene shocked her. The boy was trapped inside the wardrobe, and the nanny was on the phone, laughing and arranging with someone the tragic accident the boy would suffer that very night, so she could inherit everything. Richard Sterling's empire was a fortress of glass and silence, built on the pillars of a fortune that seemed to grow of its own accord. The walls, high and white, reflected the cold, late afternoon light, but held no warmth. He walked into his home, and the sound of his expensive shoes on the polished marble was the only proof of his arrival. In the vast hall, framed by a window that opened onto a geometrically perfect garden, the scene that greeted him should have been a balm for his weary soul. Agatha, his son's nanny, was reading a story to little Leo. Her voice was a soft, controlled melody, each word pronounced with the perfection of a stage actress. Leo, sitting at a respectful distance, listened with a stillness that Richard, in his constant absence, mistook for good behavior. He paused in the doorway, his heart tight with a guilt that no amount of money could erase. Every new deal closed, every successful investment on Wall Street was another brick in the wall separating him from his own son. He justified it by saying he was building a future, a solid portfolio that would protect Leo from all the world's uncertainties. But deep down, he knew he was just running from the pain the empty house had held since his wife's departure. Agatha looked up and smiled, a rehearsed but effective smile. "Mr. Sterling, welcome home. Leo and I were just finishing the chapter." She closed the book with a delicate gesture, the hardcover making a crisp, lonely sound. Leo didn't run to his father, he just watched, his large, dark eyes like mirrors of a deep, mysterious well. Richard forced a smile, approaching. "How was your day, champ?" The question hung in the air, almost a formality. Leo shrugged, a contained, almost imperceptible movement. "Fine," he whispered, the word lost in the immensity of the room. Agatha stepped forward, filling the void with her usual efficiency. He ate all his lunch, finished his homework, and practiced piano for 30 minutes, as scheduled. His behavior was exemplary. The nanny was the pillar that sustained order in his chaotic world. With impeccable references and a posture that bordered on perfection, she allowed Richard to dedicate himself to turning his already vast capital into an almost immeasurable fortune, accumulating assets and property that would guarantee generations of comfort. He trusted her implicitly, a blind and desperate trust. Just then, the doorbell rang, a sharp chime that broke the monotony. Agatha answered it, and soon returned, accompanied by a middle-aged woman with a face etched with lines of worry and a gaze that seemed to carry the weight of many stories. Her hands were weathered, those of someone who knew hard work. "Sir, this is Lucia, the new housekeeper from the agency." Richard acknowledged her with a nod, his mind already returning to a meeting about the profitability of his hedge funds. Lucia, however, didn't look at the opulence of the house or the multimillionaire before her. Her eyes, a deep and observant brown, landed directly on the boy. It was an instant, a fraction of a second in time. Agatha, with her imperturbable smile, placed a hand on Leo's shoulder to guide him toward the stairs, and that's when Lucia saw it. It wasn't a sudden movement, nor a sound. It was a tremor, an almost invisible shrinking of the shoulders, a stiffening of the child's small spine beneath the touch of that seemingly gentle hand, a shiver of fear, as swift and silent as a falling leaf, that Richard, the empire builder, never noticed. But Lucia, the woman of few words, saw, and in her heart, a seed of unease began to sprout. Lucia's first days in the mansion were an immersion into a world of silent opulence. She polished marble floors that reflected her face with the clarity of a mirror, and dusted works of art whose value likely exceeded that of her own home. Every object, every piece of furniture, was a testament to Richard's immense fortune, an accumulation of assets and property that seemed endless. One morning, while cleaning the library, she overheard a snippet of Richard's phone conversation, words like dollars, profitability, and investment funds floating in the air like a language from another planet. He was a man who built empires as easily as he breathed, yet he seemed incapable of building a bridge to his own son. It was in Leo's room that Lucia's heart ached the most. The room was impeccable, worthy of a children's design magazine, with a collection of toy cars and superhero action figures lined up on shelves with military precision. However, a thin layer of dust coated the toys, revealing a desolate truth. They were part of the scenery, not objects of joy. They were never touched. Lucia tried small gestures, a discreet smile in the hallway, a whispered good morning when Agatha wasn't around. In return, she received a frightened look from Leo, a glimpse of a soul that yearned for connection but had been taught to fear it. Agatha, for her part, maintained constant vigilance. Her eyes seemed to be everywhere, and her presence was a shadow that stretched across every room. She corrected Lucia for trivialities, a picture frame a millimeter out of place, a cleaning product that, according to her, was not ideal for the type of wood. They were small jabs, disguised as professionalism, but Lucia felt the growing hostility. She realized that any affectionate glance toward Leo was seen by Agatha as a transgression, an invasion of her territory. The nanny controlled the boy's world with an iron fist, from what he ate to the stories he heard before bed. Stories that Lucia sometimes overheard from the hallway, and which always seemed to have a dark tone, immoral about obedience and loneliness. One day, while cleaning behind the heavy dresser in Leo's room, her fingers found a small folded piece of paper, almost hidden in the gap between the furniture and the wall. Curious, she picked it up and unfolded it. It was a drawing made with crayons. On one side, a small figure with features indicating a crying face. Beside it, a tall, slender figure with a wide, empty smile drawn on its face. But it wasn't the smile that sent a shiver down Lucia's spine. It was the tall figure's hands. Instead of fingers, there were long, sharp talons extended toward the small, crying boy. A wave of cold washed over her. This wasn't just a drawing. It was a cry for help, a silent scream echoing through that empty house. She quickly folded the paper and tucked it into her apron pocket, her heart hammering against her ribs. Now she knew, with a terrible certainty, that the perfection of this house and the kindness of Agatha were just a facade for something much darker. She looked through the half-open door into the silent hallway, but the silence now had a different weight, a veiled threat. She could no longer ignore it. She had to understand what those talons in the drawing truly meant. Leo's drawing was tucked away in Lucia's pocket, but the image of the talons remained etched in her mind, a dark stain on her thoughts. From that day on, she began to watch Agatha with meticulous attention, dissecting every gesture, every word, every smile. On the surface, the nanny remained the epitome of competence. Her movements were graceful, her voice a balm of calm and patience. She helped Leo with his meals, read stories with perfect intonations, and supervised his playtime with an efficiency that Richard would undoubtedly admire in one of his business managers. However, Lucia now saw what lay beneath the surface. She saw the way Leo's body tensed when Agatha's hand came near to fix his hair, an almost imperceptible flinch. She saw the absence of light in the boy's eyes when the nanny handed him a toy, as if he were receiving a task, not a gift. The silence of the house, once merely melancholic, now felt charged with a suffocating tension, a secret that screamed without making a sound. Lucia knew she couldn't remain just a spectator. She had to create a crack in that wall of fear. The next morning, while tending to the garden, she saw a small lavender flower, a vibrant and delicate purple. Her heart racing, she picked it. Later, while cleaning Leo's room, as Agatha was in the kitchen preparing the boy's snack, Lucia acted. With trembling hands, she placed the small flower in a glass of water and left it on the nightstand, next to a book that seemed to have never been opened. It was a minuscule gesture in such a vast house, a drop of color in a universe of neutral tones, but for her, it was an act of defiance, a silent message to the boy, "I see you." She moved away quickly, adrenaline pulsing through her veins, and resumed her work in the hallway, her ears on high alert. When Agatha brought Leo back to his room, there was a pause, a silence longer than usual. Lucia held her breath. Then she heard Agatha's voice, falsely sweet. "Well, what is this? We don't need weeds in here, do we?" Through the crack in the door, Lucia saw Agatha pick up the flower with her fingertips, as if it was something dirty, and throw it in the trash. Leo, standing by the bed, watched the scene with his eyes downcast, but Lucia could see his small hands clenching into fists at his sides. In that instant, she knew her message had been received. Agatha's reaction, however, was not long in coming. Later, as Lucia cleaned the sumptuous living room, the nanny approached, her polished smile firmly in place. "Lucia, dear," she began, her voice like poisoned honey, "I've noticed you seem a bit distracted today. Mr. Sterling's net worth is incalculable, and every piece in this house is irreplaceable. He does not tolerate carelessness." She ran her index finger over a perfectly clean lacquer coffee table and held it up, showing an invisible speck of dust. "Oh, this cannot happen again. A mistake can be very costly for all of us." The threat was clear, veiled under a layer of false concern. Agatha knew, and she was making it clear that a war had begun. Agatha's war wasn't fought with shouts, but with the quiet poison of mistrust. She watched Lucia with the patience of a spider, waiting for the right moment to weave her web. The opportunity came on a Tuesday afternoon when Richard returned home earlier than usual, his face marked by the tension of a negotiation involving millions of dollars and the volatility of the crypto market. He was a man who dealt with monumental stress in his business, managing capital that spanned continents, and what he most desired upon crossing his doorstep was the peace and order his money could buy. Agatha intercepted him in the entryway, her expression perfectly calibrated to show concern and reluctance. "Mr. Sterling, I do apologize for bothering you," she began, her voice low and respectful. "It's about Lucia. I know she has a good heart, but she's been a bit slow with her tasks, and what worries me more, she insists on trying to interact with Leo, which disrupts his routine and leaves him very agitated. Just today, I had to redo all the cleaning in the East Wing." Richard ran a hand through his hair, his mind still spinning with interest rates and financial applications. To him, Agatha was the pillar that kept his domestic world running perfectly, an asset as valuable as any blue-chip stock in his portfolio. Her complaint, coming from such a reliable source, fell on fertile ground. He didn't have the time or energy to deal with domestic issues. He paid handsomely not to have them. "I understand, Agatha. Thank you for letting me know. I'll speak with her," he said, his voice heavy with an exhaustion Lucia had never seen. Later, he found her in the kitchen, drying the last crystal glass. He leaned against the doorframe, his imposing figure filling the space. "Lucia," he began, his tone not angry, but one of a weary disappointment that cut deeper than any shout. "I hired you to clean the house, not to be a distraction. Leo has a very specific routine, and Agatha is responsible for it. Please, focus on your duties and maintain a professional distance from my son." Each word was a blow. Lucia felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her pale and cold. She opened her mouth to defend herself, to talk about the drawing, about the boy's frightened eyes, but the words died in her throat. She looked at this man, a multi-millionaire whose fortune was legendary, and saw only a blind father, a man so immersed in building his empire that he couldn't see the emotional ruin taking root under his own roof. She just nodded, unable to articulate a response. As Richard turned and left, she looked up and saw, in the crack of the hallway door, two large, frightened eyes watching her. Leo had seen everything. He didn't run to his father, nor did he hide from Lucia. He just stood there, a silent witness to the injustice, and in his gaze, Lucia saw a reflection of her own pain and powerlessness. It was in that moment that sadness transformed into a cold, determined fury. Words wouldn't work. Against Agatha's impeccable reputation and Richard's blind trust, her voice had no value. She needed something that couldn't be denied, irrefutable proof. Sitting in the solitude of the pantry, the smell of cleaning products in the air, she took out her cell phone. The screen lit up, and an idea, dangerous and necessary, began to take shape. If no one could hear her scream, maybe they could hear the cruel whisper that echoed through the halls. The injustice of Richard's reprimand didn't break Lucia's spirit. Instead, it forged her sorrow into a steel of determination. She was not a woman of great means or intellectual capital, but she possessed a wealth that couldn't be measured in dollars or Bitcoin, a sharp intuition and a sense of right and wrong that was her true north. That night, in her modest apartment, she looked at her cell phone not as a device for calls, but as the only weapon she possessed. The idea that had formed was risky, a gamble that could cost her the job she desperately needed, but the image of Leo's face, a blank canvas where joy should have painted its colors, compelled her to act. She knew she had to be smarter, more careful than Agatha. She needed to move like a shadow within that house, which was, for her, hostile territory. Her strategy was simple and dangerous: to use the time she spent cleaning the opposite wing of the mansion, specifically Richard's master suite at the end of a long corridor, to leave her phone recording. The next day, her heart beat erratically, a drum of anxiety against her ribs. With sweaty hands, she found the perfect spot, behind a heavy ceramic vase that decorated a console table in the hallway, exactly halfway between Richard's suite and Leo's room. It offered reasonable acoustics and was discreet enough not to arouse suspicion. As Agatha took Leo to his room for his quiet reading period, Lucia, under the pretext of getting more cleaning supplies, walked down the hall. Her movements were swift and precise. She propped the phone behind the vase, started the audio recorder, and walked away, feeling the weight of 1,000 invisible eyes on her back. For the next hour, as she scrubbed and polished the luxurious fixtures in Richard's room, her mind was yards away in the silent corridor, trying to catch any sound, any whisper. Every creak of the floorboards, every door closing somewhere in the house made her jump. When the time was up, she retrieved the device with the same furtive discretion. She hid in the staff bathroom, hands trembling as she plugged in her earbuds. She pressed play, her breath caught in her throat. What she heard was nothing. The sound of distant footsteps, the hum of the central air system, the rustling of book pages, and mostly a deep, oppressive silence. There was no hissing voice, no muffled cry, just emptiness. She tried again the next day and the next. With each attempt, the same frustration. The recording contained only the sterile normality of the house. Agatha was a ghost, cruel in her presence but intangible in her actions. Doubt began to eat away at Lucia's certainty. Had she misinterpreted everything? Was the drawing just a child's nightmare? On Friday, at the end of another useless recording, she felt drained. From the laundry room window, she saw Agatha gently pushing Leo on a swing in the garden. The afternoon sun illuminated the scene, and from a distance, it looked like a picture of perfect harmony. Agatha was smiling, and Leo, for a brief moment, didn't seem so scared. A wave of despair hit her. What if Richard was right? What if she was just a meddling housekeeper, seeing monsters where there was nothing but her own imagination? The weekend was torment for Lucia. Away from the mansion, the images swirled in her mind, the drawing of the talons, the fear in Leo's eyes, Richard's reprimand, the idyllic scene on the swing. Doubt was a weed, growing and choking her determination. She replayed the events, questioning her own sanity. Maybe she was just projecting her own fears and hardships onto this family's life. After all, who was she? A simple housekeeper, to judge the dynamics of a world so far removed from her own, a world of wealth and power where the rules were different. Maybe Leo's silence wasn't fear, but just shyness. Maybe Agatha's rigidity wasn't cruelty, but excessive professional zeal. She felt small, powerless, an ant trying to move a mountain. The idea of abandoning her silent investigation and just focusing on her job, securing the money she needed to live, became tempting. It would be easier, safer. On Monday, she returned to the mansion with a heavy heart. She decided it would be her last day of spying. If the recording revealed nothing, she would delete the audio files, forget the drawing, and resign herself to being just the woman who cleaned the dust. The day passed with the same oppressive normality as always. Richard left early for a meeting about the fluctuating price of gold on the international market, a topic that seemed as abstract and distant from Lucia's reality as the stars. Agatha conducted Leo's routine with her usual efficiency. The time came. With a resigned heart, Lucia placed the phone behind the vase, like an empty ritual, and headed to Richard's master suite. This time, however, something was different. She didn't feel the adrenaline of expectation, only the weariness of imminent defeat. She worked methodically, her mind blank, her body moving on autopilot. Time passed. She cleaned the marble bathroom, polished the silver faucets, made the bed with sheets that cost more than her rent. When she finished, she collected the phone and, without any hope, locked herself in the staff bathroom. She put in her earbuds, her shoulders slumped in exhaustion. She pressed play. The first few minutes were filled with the familiar silence. She sighed, ready to give up. And then she heard it. At first, it was almost imperceptible, a low sound, a murmur. She turned the volume to maximum, pressing the earbuds against her ears. The sound became clearer. It was Leo's voice. But it wasn't a voice of play, nor of conversation. It was the muffled, uneven sound of a stifled cry, the kind of crying that desperately tries not to be heard. Lucia's heart gave a painful leap. She leaned closer to the phone, as if she could enter the recording, and then the other voice emerged. It was Agatha, but it wasn't the soft, melodic voice everyone knew. It was a low, venomous hiss, laden with a cruelty that chilled the air in Lucia's lungs. Your father will never love you the way he loved your mother. You're a useless burden, a reminder of what he lost. Every time he looks at you, he only sees her absence. You think all this wealth, this entire fortune, will one day be yours. You don't deserve anything. You are nothing. The silence that followed was cut by a choked sob from Leo. And Lucia, sitting on the cold bathroom floor, felt tears stream down her face, not of sadness, but of a pure, incandescent rage. The doubt vanished, consumed by the fire of certainty. She had her proof. The recording was a loaded gun, and Lucia held it with hands that trembled, not from fear, but from righteous fury. The venom in Agatha's words echoed in her mind, each syllable proof of the monstrosity hiding beneath the polished smile. Doubt had given way to a cutting clarity. She wasn't crazy. That boy was living in a silent hell, and she was the only person who held the key to his prison door. For a moment, the idea of going directly to Richard, of throwing the recording on his mahogany desk and forcing him to hear the truth, tempted her. but she hesitated. She remembered his look of disappointment, the ease with which he had believed Agatha's lies. Richard was blind, entrenched in his fortress of trust. Presenting the recording abruptly could be seen as a trap, a conspiracy by a disgruntled employee. Agatha was a master manipulator. She could twist the situation, claim the audio was edited, that it was revenge. Lucia needed more. She needed something visual, irrefutable, something Richard's eyes could not deny. Her plan shifted. The audio recording wasn't the end. It was the beginning. It was the confirmation that her intuition was right and the fuel for the next much riskier step. She decided to keep leaving the recorder, but now with a new purpose, to study Agatha's patterns, understand her schedules, predict her movements. She needed to find out if verbal cruelty was the limit, or if there was something even darker hidden in the shadows. The week dragged on. Lucia lived in a state of constant alert, each day a torture of silent surveillance. The recording captured more poisonous whispers, more moments of stifled crying. They were like needles piercing her heart, but she forced herself to listen, to catalogue the pain, to build her case. She noticed a pattern. Agatha's cruelty intensified on the afternoons when Richard called to say he would be late. Consumed by meetings about his gold investments or analyzing the volatile stock market, it was as if her boss's prolonged absence gave her a license to be even more vile. On Friday afternoon, the house phone rang. Lucia, cleaning the entryway, saw Agatha answer. The nanny's posture visibly relaxed as she listened. "Of course, Mr. Sterling. Don't worry. I'll take care of everything. Have a great meeting about your business." The final word was said with a slight touch of disdain that only Lucia's attentive ears caught. Richard would be tied up late. A chill ran down Lucia's spine. Something told her this afternoon would be different. She hid the phone in its usual spot and went to the east wing, but her heart was in the hallway, her ears stretched to their limit. The silence stretched for almost an hour, a heavy, unnatural silence. Then she heard it. It wasn't a muffled cry, it was a scream. A sharp, piercing scream of pure pain and terror coming from Leo's room. The sound cut through the air like a knife, tearing the veil of the house's normality. This wasn't emotional abuse, it was physical. Lucia dropped her dustcloth, her blood running cold. She didn't think. There was no more plan, no more strategy. There was only that scream. She ran, her feet slapping against the polished marble. The sound of her own heart pounding in her ears. Each step was an eternity. She flew down the hall, the image of the cowering boy in her mind. She didn't hesitate at the door. She twisted the knob and burst it open, her body propelled by a force she didn't know she possessed. The scene that greeted her paralyzed her for an instant of pure horror, freezing time and the air in her lungs. The scene before Lucia's eyes was a nightmare frozen in time, an image that would never be erased from her memory. Agatha, the woman who glided through the house with the elegance of someone managing a vast fortune, had none of that refinement now. Her face was contorted into a mask of raw, unfiltered fury, a terrifying sight that belied months of rehearsed smiles. Her hands, which Lucia had so often seen delicately polishing silverware, were clamped onto Leo's small shoulders. She wasn't just holding the boy. She was shaking him with a controlled but undeniable violence, her fingers digging the thin fabric of his pajamas into the child's fragile skin. Leo's face was red, streaked with tears. His wide eyes were deep pools of absolute terror, and his mouth was open in a silent scream that had followed the audible one, as if the air had been knocked out of him. Lucia's paralysis lasted only a fraction of a second, the time it took her brain to process the horror. What followed was pure instinct, a primal force that ignored hierarchies, employment contracts, or her own desperate need for that end-of-the-month paycheck. She didn't see a multimillionaire's trusted nanny. She saw a monster attacking a defenseless child. "Let him go, now!" Lucia's voice thundered through the room, imbued with an authority she didn't know she possessed. She crossed the space in 2 long strides, fueled by a fierce adrenaline, and physically placed herself between the aggressor and the victim. With a sharp movement, she wrenched Agatha's hands off Leo's shoulders, using surprising strength. The moment the physical contact was broken, Agatha stumbled back a step. It was as if a switch had been flipped. The visceral rage vanished from her face instantly, replaced by a fabricated expression of shock and outrage. Leo, freed from her grasp, collapsed against Lucia's legs. He wrapped his thin arms around her knees, trembling so violently that Lucia could feel the vibration of the boy's fear through her own body. Lucia immediately knelt, ignoring Agatha's toxic presence, and wrapped Leo in a protective embrace, creating a human shield around him. She felt his little heart hammering against her chest, fast as a frightened bird's wings. "It's okay, Leo. I'm here. No one is going to hurt you," she whispered into his hair, her own voice thick with emotion. For the first time since she had arrived at that house, the boy didn't shrink from touch. He clung to her desperately, burying his face in her shoulder, now sobbing audibly, a cry of relief and accumulated pain. Agatha, recovering her icy composure, smoothed her impeccable blouse. She looked at Lucia with a contempt that could freeze hell. "Have you lost your mind?" "Lucia," she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "How dare you burst in here like this and put your hands on me?" The boy was having a tantrum, an uncontrollable fit. "I was applying a necessary restraining measure. You understand nothing about raising a child who will inherit a fortune of this magnitude." The lie was told with such conviction that had Lucia not seen the scene with her own eyes, she might have doubted it. But she had felt the malice radiating from the woman. Lucia looked up, still holding Leo, and met Agatha's gaze with unwavering firmness. All of Richard's capital, all his international deals were worthless if they couldn't protect his son inside his own home. "I saw what you were doing, Agatha, and it wasn't restraint, it was cruelty," Lucia said. Agatha took a step forward, invading Lucia's personal space, her eyes narrowing. She blocked the door with her body, a cold smile curving her lips, turning the luxurious room into a suffocating trap. Leo's room, once a sanctuary of oppressive silence, now vibrated with a palpable tension. The air was thin, charged with unspoken words and open hostility. Agatha, blocking the exit, seemed to have grown taller, her slender silhouette transforming into an insurmountable barrier. Her cold smile was a declaration of power. In this territory, she was the queen, and Lucia, the intruder. Leo still trembled in Lucia's arms, but his sobs had subsided, replaced by a ragged, frightened breathing. He kept his face hidden, as if the sight of Agatha was too much to bear. Lucia, with the boy's body pressed firmly against hers, felt a mixture of fear and defiance. She was at a disadvantage, a simple employee against the confidant of a man whose wealth gave him almost absolute power. But her fear for Leo's safety far outweighed any fear for her own future. She would not back down. "You're a fool if you think you can challenge me," Agatha said, her voice low, almost a conspiratorial whisper. "You are a nobody, a housekeeper. I am the person Richard trusts with his most precious asset, the person who helps him maintain order so he can continue to multiply his assets and his net worth. Your word against mine, it's a joke." She gestured around the impeccable room. "Look at this. Order. Discipline. This is what a child like Leo needs. He's weak, spoiled. I am strengthening him, preparing him for the world that awaits, a world where he'll have to manage a multi-billion-dollar inheritance. You, with your cheap sentimentality, are only making him weaker." The twisted logic was as shocking as the physical assault. Agatha actually believed her own narrative, saw herself as a benefactor, not a tormentor. "This isn't strength, it's abuse," Lucia replied. her voice steady despite her racing heart. "You are breaking his spirit. A child needs love, not fear." Agatha's smile widened. Love. Love left him motherless and with a father who barely sees him. Love is a weakness people like us can't afford. I give him what he needs, structure, and Richard pays me very well for it. A salary that includes stock options in his company. He knows the value of my work. The mention of money, of stock, was a way to reassert her status, to put Lucia in her place. But Lucia refused to be intimidated. The truth was her armor. She began to rise slowly, bringing Leo with her, never breaking physical contact. "Get out of the way, Agatha. We're leaving this room." "And where will you go? To tell your fantasy story to anyone who will listen?" Agatha laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Richard will be home in an hour, and I will tell him how you stormed into the room, assaulted me, and terrified the boy, who was perfectly calm until your hysterical arrival. He'll believe me. He always does." Agatha's confidence was absolute, and Lucia knew there was a terrible truth to her words. Without the context of the recording, the scene could easily be twisted. In that moment of stalemate, the sound of a car approaching on the mansion's long gravel driveway reached their ears, a sound that shouldn't have been there for at least another hour. Agatha's eyes widened for a fraction of a second, a crack in her facade of control. Richard, he was home. The meeting about the interest and dividends on his investment funds must have ended early. The homeowner's unexpected arrival turned Agatha's trap into a stage, and the first act was about to begin with Lucia and Leo at its center in the most unfavorable light possible. The sound of the luxury engine shutting off was the trigger. Richard's arrival lit the fuse of the time bomb the room had become. Agatha, in a stunning metamorphosis, shed her mask of coldness. Tears welled in her eyes with theatrical ease, and a rehearsed sob escaped her lips. She shrank back, adopting the posture of a terrified victim. The sound of the front door opening and Richard's firm footsteps in the entryway echoed like the march of a judge approaching the bench. When Richard's imposing figure appeared in the doorway, he was met with a tableau of chaos. The first thing he saw was Agatha, his reliable and level-headed nanny, cowering near the wall, weeping profusely. The second was Lucia, the housekeeper, standing in the middle of the room, holding his son, who seemed to be hiding behind her. Richard's brain, trained to process information and make swift decisions based on reliable data, interpreted the scene in the most obvious way. "Richard, thank God!" Agatha cried. Her voice choked. "This woman, and she's gone insane. I don't know what got into her. She came in here screaming, accusing me of horrible things, and then she attacked me." She held out an arm, as if to show an invisible injury. She grabbed Leo so hard, he's terrified. I tried to calm her down, but she was out of her mind. Each word was a precise stab, calculated to paint Lucia as an unstable lunatic. Her version was a perverse distortion of the truth, but it contained just enough elements of reality. Lucia's sudden entry, the physical confrontation to free Leo, to sound plausible to a man who lacked the full context. Richard, coming from a stressful afternoon re-evaluating the profitability of his treasury bond investments, felt a wave of fury and exhaustion. He paid a fortune for peace at home, for his house to be a sanctuary, not a battlefield. "What are you doing?" he yelled, his voice resonating with the authority of someone who commands boardrooms. His eyes flashed toward Lucia. "Let go of my son. Now, you're fired." The accusation was a hammer, and the sentence followed immediately, without a chance for defense. Lucia felt the floor vanish from beneath her. She looked at this powerful blind man, and for an instant, despair overwhelmed her. She had no way to fight this. Her voice would be drowned out by Agatha's performance. She instinctively held Leo tighter, as if to shield him from the unfolding injustice. And that's when the tide began to turn, not with a bang, but with a silent gesture. Richard took a step forward. ready to take his son from the arms of the woman he now saw as a threat. "Leo, come to Daddy. It's all right now," he said, softening his voice, holding out his hand. But then he stopped. He saw his son. Leo didn't move. He didn't run into his father's arms for safety. Instead, the boy clung with desperate strength to Lucia's legs, hiding his face completely in the rough fabric of her uniform, his small hands gripping the material as if she were his only anchor in a stormy sea. In that gesture, in that silent refusal to seek his father's refuge, an irrefutable truth, more powerful than any accusation or defense, began to reveal itself. Leo's gesture was a silent thunderclap in the middle of the storm. For Richard, a man accustomed to deciphering complex stock charts and predicting market trends, that small act from his son was an anomaly, a piece of data that didn't fit the pattern. His command, "Let go of my son," was based on the assumption that Leo was being held against his will, but the boy's reaction viscerally contradicted that premise. Leo wasn't being held, he was holding on. Richard's outstretched hand remained in the air, helpless. The fury in his eyes began to falter, giving way to a profound confusion. He looked at the top of his son's head, buried in Lucia's uniform, and then at the housekeeper's face. He saw pain and determination in her eyes, not the madness Agatha had described. And then he looked at Agatha. She, sensing his hesitation, intensified her performance. "See what she's done to him, Richard," Agatha sobbed, pointing a trembling finger. "She's confused him, put things in his head. He's in shock." But the words, which would have once been accepted as absolute truth, now sounded hollow, a little too desperate. Richard's blind trust, the bedrock of his relationship with Agatha, had suffered its first crack. He was a master at analyzing liabilities and assets on his balance sheets. For the first time, he began to question the value of one of his most important domestic assets. The silence that settled in the room was heavy, thick. Richard lowered his hand, his mind working furiously to reevaluate the scene, to find a logic that explained the anomaly. It was Lucia who broke the silence. Her voice wasn't one of pleading, but of a calm, firm authority, the voice of someone who holds the truth. "Ask him, Richard," she said softly, never taking her eyes off him. "Ask your son why he won't come to you." The suggestion was simple, direct, and terrifying. Richard never asked Leo about his feelings. He assumed the routine, the material comfort, Agatha's constant presence were enough. He knelt slowly, bringing himself to his son's eye level, though Leo still refused to look. "Leo?" he called, his voice uncertain, stripped of its usual self-assurance. "Son, look at me. What happened?" The boy just trembled, gripping the fabric of Lucia's uniform even tighter. His fear was palpable, a cold fog in the room. Agatha, seeing she was losing control of the narrative, tried to intervene. "Richard, don't pressure him. He's not in a state to—" "Be quiet, Agatha." Richard's command was like the crack of a whip, so sudden and sharp it made her recoil, shock written all over her face. He had never spoken to her that way. All his focus was on his son, on this small enigma of fear and silence. Lucia, sensing the boy's terror of speaking, decided to act. With one hand, she stroked Leo's hair, and with the other, she reached into her apron pocket, her heart hammered. It was time. "Richard," she said, her voice firm, drawing his gaze. "I didn't attack anyone. I heard screaming. I ran to help." She pulled the cell phone from her pocket. "And I have something you need to hear, something that will explain everything." The phone in her hand seemed small, insignificant amid the vastness of this wealth. But it held a treasure of incalculable value. The truth. She held it out, offering it like the final piece of the puzzle, the key that could finally open this blind father's eyes. The cell phone in Lucia's hand was the epicenter of the earthquake about to shake the foundations of that house. Richard looked from the device to Lucia, the confusion on his face deepening. Agatha, on the other hand, turned visibly pale. her eyes fixed on the phone as if it were a snake poised to strike. She knew what it might contain. The bluff, the manipulation, the web of lies. It was all about to come crashing down. "What is this nonsense?" she said, trying to force a derisive laugh that came out strangled. "Are you going to show us pictures of your family? Richard, this is ridiculous. Get her out of here." But her panic was palpable. The victim facade was disintegrating, revealing the desperate woman beneath. Richard ignored her completely. He stood up, his gaze fixed on Lucia, and held out his hand, not for his son, but for the phone. "Show me," he said, his voice low and grave. Lucia unlocked the screen with a trembling finger and navigated to that afternoon's audio file. The sound of her own heart seemed louder than any sound that could come from the tiny speaker. She didn't hand the device over. Instead, she held it firmly and pressed play. The silence of the recording filled the room for a few seconds, raising the tension to an almost unbearable level. And then Agatha's voice, distorted by the audio quality but unmistakable, cut through the air, hissing and cruel. "Your father will never love you the way he loved your mother. You're a useless burden, a reminder of what he lost." Richard's face transformed. Confusion gave way to shocked disbelief. He looked at Agatha, who seemed to have turned into a statue of ice, her face drained of color. The recording continued, each word a hammer blow against Richard's armor of denial. "You think all this wealth, this entire fortune, will one day be yours. You don't deserve anything. You are nothing." Leo's muffled crying on the recording was a ghostly echo of the boy trembling against Lucia. It was as if a veil had been ripped from Richard's eyes. He wasn't just hearing, he was seeing. Seeing the months of his son's silence, the frightened glances, the untouched toys, all in a new and terrible light. His blindness had not been accidental. It had been built on a foundation of trust he had given without question. Too busy amassing a fortune that, in that moment, felt utterly empty and meaningless. The recording ended, but the echo of the cruel words remained. The silence that followed was the heaviest that house had ever known. Agatha opened her mouth, perhaps to attempt one last lie, one final denial, but no sound came out. She was cornered by her own malice, exposed in a way that even she, in her arrogance, could never have foreseen. It was in this moment of peak tension, with the truth laid bare and raw between them, that Leo finally moved. He slowly let go of Lucia's uniform, turning his tear-streaked face to his father. He didn't run to Richard, but his eyes, for the first time in a long time, sought his father's. And then, in a small, trembling voice, yet clear as crystal, he said the only word that mattered, the word that sealed Agatha's fate and shattered Richard's heart into 1,000,000 pieces. "Daddy." It was a question, a plea, a confirmation of everything the recording had revealed. In that sound, Richard heard not just a word, but the entirety of his son's suffering. The empire of money and business he had built to protect his family had, in fact, become the cage that imprisoned his son with a monster, and he, the blind king, was the one to blame. Leo's single word, "Daddy," was the catalyst that transformed Richard's paralyzing grief into action. The guilt hit him with the force of a freight train, an overwhelming agony for his negligence, for his willful blindness. He looked at Agatha, and for the first time, he didn't see the efficient employee, but the personification of betrayal. Her mask had crumbled, revealing a cruel void that he, in his rush to manage his vast cash flow and investments, had refused to see. "Get out," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Get your things and get out of my house. Now." Agatha, seeing there was no room left for manipulation, let the victim mask drop completely, replacing it with a venomous resentment. "You'll regret this, Richard," she hissed. "He's weak. You need me." But her words no longer held any power. She was just noise. Richard picked up his phone, and with a cold efficiency he usually reserved for his business dealings, dialed security, escort Ms. Agatha off the property. Make sure she takes nothing that doesn't belong to her. Her presence is no longer welcome." As the security guards carried out the order, a deep, strange silence settled in the room. The monster had been cast out, but the damage remained, like the devastation left by a hurricane. Leo was still standing next to Lucia, looking at his father with a mixture of fear and cautious hope. Richard approached slowly, kneeling again, not as a father giving a command, but as a supplicant. "Leo, my son, I'm so sorry." His voice broke. The tears he hadn't shed since his wife's death finally came, a flood of guilt and regret. "I didn't see. I was here, but I didn't see. Forgive me." He didn't hold out his arms, didn't force contact. He waited, making himself vulnerable for the first time in front of his son. Leo looked to Lucia as if for permission or assurance. She gave a slight nod, a gentle, encouraging smile. Slowly, Leo took one step, then another, crossing the chasm that had separated them. He touched his father's shoulder, a hesitant gesture, and when Richard wrapped him in a desperate embrace, the boy didn't pull away. For the first time in years, father and son truly hugged, an embrace that was both an apology and a promise of a new beginning. Lucia watched the scene, her heart overflowing with an emotion that was a mix of relief and sorrow. Her work here was done. She turned discreetly to leave, to give them privacy, now feeling like an intruder in this sacred moment of reconciliation. But Richard's voice stopped her. "Lucia, please, don't go." He stood, still holding Leo's hand, and turned to her. His eyes were red, but clear. "Free from the fog of denial, I don't have the words to thank you. You saved my son. You saved me. I was a fool. I was so focused on building a portfolio for his future that I forgot to build a present for him." He looked around the luxurious room, the immense house. None of this matters. Not the dollars, the euros, or the crypto. Nothing. Only him. He turned back to Lucia, the gratitude on his face deepening into profound admiration. "I owe you everything. What can I do? Money? A bonus? Name your price." Lucia shook her head. "I didn't do it for money, Richard. I did it for him." She looked at Leo, who was now holding his father's hand a little more tightly. In that moment, the true wealth in that room wasn't in Richard's vaults, but in the fragile, newly rediscovered bond between a father and son, a bond a courageous woman had helped restore. In the days that followed, Richard's mansion underwent a transformation more profound than any architectural renovation could provide. The oppressive silence gave way to sounds long unheard there. The sound of laughter echoed through the halls, a little hesitant at first, but growing in confidence each day. The sound of toy cars rolling across the marble floor, of a father reading stories with funny voices, of the clinking of silverware during dinners where the conversation wasn't about the stock market or the next big investment, but about superheroes and the shapes of clouds. Richard cancelled all non-essential meetings. He delegated the day-to-day management of his vast assets to his most trusted subordinates, realizing that the greatest return he could ever get wasn't on any financial chart, but in the light returning to his son's eyes. He learned to disconnect from the world of business to connect with the small universe that was Leo. Together, they began to dismantle the museum Agatha had created, turning the house into a home. Toys were freed from their shelves, and a thin layer of happy dust began to settle in formerly pristine places. Lucia tried to say goodbye the day after Agatha's dismissal, feeling her mission was accomplished, but Richard begged her to stay, not as a housekeeper. "Lucia," he said, the sincerity in his voice undeniable, "stay as a friend, a guardian. I don't know what I'm doing. You taught me how to see my own son. Please, help me build a real home for him." Lucia, seeing the honesty in his request and the pleading look in Leo's eyes, agreed to stay, but on her own terms. She became a house manager, a confidant. but above all, the emotional bedrock of this rebuilding family. Richard's gratitude for her blossomed into deep admiration. He watched the way she interacted with Leo, with a patience and affection that were as natural as breathing. He saw the woman who, without possessing gold or stocks, had the greatest wealth of all, a pure heart and unwavering courage. One afternoon, weeks later, Richard found Lucia in the garden, helping Leo plant a small lavender flower, just like the one Agatha had thrown away. The afternoon sun bathed the scene in a golden light, and the happiness emanating from them was as real and tangible as the dirt on their hands. In that moment, Richard understood that the love growing in his chest wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper, something he thought he had lost forever. He approached, his heart pounding with an anxiety he hadn't felt since his first big risk on the stock exchange. "Lucia," he began, "you came into this house to clear away the dust, but you ended up clearing the darkness from our souls. You became the light we both desperately needed." He took her hand, her palms smudged with soil. "I know it's a lot to ask, but would you consider staying and becoming part of this family you helped save?" Lucia looked up at him, and in his eyes, she didn't see the billionaire, the magnate, but the man, the father, vulnerable and sincere. She looked at Leo, who was beaming at her, a genuine, radiant smile, and in his smile, she found her answer.